gun buybacks and turn-in programs. We have those happening all throughout the United States every single year.
And they have gun buyback to create the news images of people lined up turning guns in to create the perception that guns are bad. They're the police to acclimate. But again, as you just pointed out, the U.S. military are masters of gun disarmament of the general public, as they call it, micro-disarmament. And the new UN treaty, you made a film on this, breaks down in Article 15. They're right there saying that states will aid other states and the UN in micro-disarmament, and they admit that that's their plan. I mean, it's just incredible that we're this far down the line, and now they want to use the drones. Please continue, but I want to get back into the drones.
All right.
I mean, do you see the same path that I see us going down, where the system is now going to autonomous drones, where it's not even these heroes in the air conditioning killing people, to where the technocrats literally have armies of their own combat mechs?
This is in the literature, to point out. They aspire to do this. Whether their ability will match their aspirations, I can't tell you, but they certainly have envisioned a scenario in which you'd have this Skynet type of vertically integrated and thoroughly mechanized system, or to use the Battlestar Galactica idiom, that'd be a little bit like the Cylons, where you have fully mechanized and independently, autonomously functioning mechanisms of death that are involved in routine punitive strikes, and which carry out programs intended to spare the exposure of military personnel to the dangers that would be involved in actually carrying out these missions. I mean, obviously, cyber war, that's long-distance war involving drone strikes right now, is a generous step along that direction. And I want to make a point here that really the most dangerous drone is the one that is operating the joystick and not the one operated by the joystick. The drone being the human drone who sits in one of these air-conditioned offices in Nevada or Virginia.
Yeah, you quoted some of them from the New York Times where they were just like, I do not think about who I'm killing. I do what I am told. They are bad. They are converting this. It's the exact same nomenclature against us.
Exactly. The idea of full-spectrum dominance means that there is literally no security that one can find against the aspirations of those who want to assert the dominance. We're completely deprived of any means of resisting anything that our masters want to inflict upon us. And that's a term of art that started to come into the literature about 15 or 16 years ago. Now they're talking about it not only in terms of operations other than war overseas, but here domestically. Obviously, if you have a situation where these things are being carried out by soulless machines operated by people who surrendered their souls, who are inaccessible, then by definition, they are invulnerable. They're completely beyond any kind of retaliatory action. That's the type of a system that they really want to create.
And that's what full-spectrum dominance is. So then we have to look at the ruling controllers and what's their mindset. Absolutely vicious, arrogant scum who hate the family, who hate God. I mean, when you study the globalists, these are absolute power-mad materialists like Marx or Lenin or Engels. Do you agree with that statement?
I don't think that that's an exaggeration. They might not necessarily be doctrinally committed to the teachings of Marx or Engels, but they certainly behave in a Leninist fashion. Vladimir Lenin defined his philosophy of government as power without limit resting directly on force and absolutely unimpeded by laws. And whether you're talking about people who've studied the Marxist economic gibberish in terms of the way that they organize power and exercise it, they're definitely Leninists in practice. And that's not something that's confined to one or the other of the two branches of the incumbent party that we divide artificially into Republicans and Democrats. This is something that is shared pretty much by the entire ruling elite, not only politically, but academically and economically and so forth. I think it's worthwhile to point out that the aggressive dehumanization of those targeted by this system is something that has made, if you will, robots out of the people who are operating the joysticks. I've referred in an earlier article to a document that came out in 2002 in anticipation of the Second Gulf War. There was a computer program called Bugsplat, which referred to incidental casualties of civilians in a targeted area. And it was an algorithm that was supposed to calculate the number, or at least the percentage of people who would be wiped out if, for instance, a 5,000-pound bomb were lobbed into a residential neighborhood in Baghdad. And they calculated an acceptable percentage of bug splat in a given operation. Now, Tommy Franks, who reviewed this, signed off on all 22 of these operations that involved a high level of what was called bug splat. And to that idiom was added another expression, squirters, which referred to people who were observed through their surveillance technology of these drones who were injured or wounded or trying to flee. These are the type of terms that are used to create this moral distance between those.
Well, it makes it fun. It makes it fun. Yeah. But the guys sitting there doing this, they're drinking sodium fluoride water, and they wonder why at home, their son is mentally retarded because they've been hit as well. William Grigg is our guest here. We're going to get to your phone calls and a bunch of other news. Geithner and new scandals. We've got Petraeus lined up to be VP. That's what last year Steve Pieczenik said. Talk about a big insider. We got to get Dr. Pieczenik back on the show. But Obama is leaking that they're looking at Petraeus to be the VP with Romney. So we're going to be discussing that coming up as well. He sounds like a great guy for president. I mean, he laughs at the CIA, spies on us illegally through our appliances in public, admits to felonies. So why not have the general/CIA director as the vice president? There's just no end to this. And it's all how they're patriots. No, they're getting rid of our old republic, okay? Because it isn't compatible with their scientific tyranny. And humans have to take control of our development. We have to decide that we're decision makers and that we understand what's happening in the architecture in our society. We cannot just go quietly into the night because these globalists are eugenicists. You make the point that we're being turned into these biological androids, and you're absolutely right. Why do you need to have combat robots when you can just brainwash people with sleep deprivation and a feeling of elite esprit de corps after they've gone through that ritual to then be willing to do anything to not buck the peer pressure and to go out and wage war against your own people? I mean, if folks think we're decadent now, Will, where do you see us going in the future?
I think it's important to recognize that everything they do in terms of refining the machinery of oppression here is designed to bring about changes in us, assuming that there will be some of us who will be privileged to remain rather than being summarily liquidated. And I think that the people who presume to rule us want to keep at least enough of us around in order to provide the raw material upon which they will subsist. And so the takers, the parasites, can't outright kill the hosts, the people who are productive. And I think that the most ominous changes we're talking about here don't have to do necessarily with the technology involved. Once again, it has to do with what goes on between the ears of the people who are part of this system. And the militarization of the mindset of law enforcement specifically is something that I find quite remarkable. This is what's been going on now for about 40 years when the U.S. government decided to start declaring war on the possession of the use of narcotics or to declare war on terrorism, as happened just a decade or so ago. When the government puts itself on a war footing domestically, obviously it's talking about creating a battle zone out of the United States. And that's an expression we find in this article from Small Wars Journal. The battle zone would be domestic. And this is, once again, not a new development. In this book I wrote that you mentioned, Global Gun Grab, there's a chapter in here called Militarizing Mayberry that talks about the way that law enforcement and the military have been blended and conjoined. And you have the Pentagon supplying material, arms, and all kinds of training to every police department of any significant size in the country. I live across the Snake River from a little town called Ontario, Oregon. It's about 12,000 people. They have a SWAT team that trains here in Idaho with people who are from the Special Forces, teaching them how to militarize every encounter between law enforcement and civilians. And we shouldn't be called civilians, by the way. The police or the peace officers should be civilians as well. In Aurora, Colorado, a few weeks before the shooting, there was a bank robbery where the police simply shut down an entire block and arrested everybody in sight, creating, if you will, sort of a microcosmic martial law setting. They arrested everybody so they could search their cars. They handcuffed them, and then they asked permission to search their cars. There's somebody handcuffed who could resist that offer. And then in Colorado Springs, which is just a few miles away, it might be a couple of dozen miles away from Aurora, you have police wearing SWAT regalia as they're carrying out their routine duties. If you're stopped for a speeding infraction...
Yeah, that place is a beta test. That's why they staged it there. It's under their control. So. Yeah, they did it. The whole deal. They're a bunch of terrorists. And by the way, folks, they're doing all this so they can take your private property.
You are listening.
All right, is a final segment with William Grigg. Very insightful interview today. And then we're going to come back from break, go to your phone calls, and then get into all the other news I haven't covered. And boy, that's a lot. Here on this Tuesday, worldwide transmission. Will, I've been asking the questions here. In the 5 minutes we've got left on your considerable plate, what else is front and center? What else would you like to impart to our worldwide audience of freedom lovers?
I think it's worth reviewing our assumptions about how society should provide for security. If we're going to have a free and reasonably prosperous society, security has to be something for which the individual takes responsibility. And we have to start uprooting some of the bad assumptions that have been embedded in the system of politics under which we live. And the first is that the government should have a monopoly on the use of force. Say what you will about the constitutional republic we were given, one of the really interesting things that distinguishes it from any other system of government is that it explicitly repudiated the idea that government should have a monopoly on the use of force. That's what the Second Amendment is about. People get into arguments about the minutiae of the Second Amendment or the applications thereof. What they don't recognize is that by explicitly recognizing the individual right to armed self-defense, that document repudiates the idea that government has a monopoly on the use of force. Yet every political science class in this country is going to teach that concept, and that's a Leninist concept, not a Madisonian one. If the government doesn't have a monopoly on the use of force, it stands to reason that the government cannot use force that the individual is forbidden to use, and that leads us to the non-aggression principle. I have no right to commit aggression against anybody else, and I have, of course, the reciprocal right not to expect to be aggressed against. And it doesn't matter whether the aggression is committed by some tattooed gangbanger who's part of a private mob or some tattooed gangbanger who wears a government-issued costume. If it's aggressive violence, it's wrong. And I would hope that what's happening in places like Fulton, California, where there's serious consideration being given now to disbanding a police department that is murderous, I would hope that that would start to propagate itself across the country. I've helped in some very, very small way to bring about the disbanding of a couple of police departments. There's one in Covington, Texas, that was being run by a police chief who was the local drug lord. That's certainly not an uncommon thing, owing to what goes on in the name of the war on drugs. And what's happening is the pressures of the financial collapse are becoming more acute, is that a lot of municipalities are learning that they can't afford to spend the money that's been set aside in these unfunded pensions for police chiefs who can pull down $200,000 after working for 18 months.
I saw a police chief in a small town in California getting like 700 G's a year.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. And what's going on in places like Stockton or North Las Vegas, where 67% of their budget is on so-called public safety and public security, you have these unionized police forces that are...
Well, that's it. I mean, we're being held hostage by the security bureaucracy. That happens in every other third world country. Yes. And they're going to kill the golden goose if this doesn't get reversed.
Yeah, and there's getting to be some pushback here, which is why I think we're hearing discussions of the idea of full-spectrum operations in the homeland. And this scenario sketched out in the Small Wars Journal talks about a small town in South Carolina becoming an American Fallujah, where you'd have to have the Department of Homeland Security and the Pentagon essentially turn the town into a free fire zone if people don't submit to what this document calls the constitutional legitimacy of the federal government. And that, once again, assumes that the government is somehow the source of its own legitimacy.
All right, William, let me stop you. I hadn't read the whole document. I saw it a few weeks ago, I think, because you'd written about it. Excuse me? I mean, you're a respected journalist for the New American Magazine for, I don't know, decades. I hadn't read that. You're saying that full-spectrum dominance in the Homeland document talks about occupying and taking out American citizens in a city.
In a small city called Darlington, South Carolina.
Tell you what, pull that up. Can you do 5 more minutes on the other side?
Yes, I can.
All right, pull that up. I want to break this here on the air when we come back. We've gotten the re-education camp document. We've gotten the secret arrest document, the secret kill document. Now the gun confiscation document, and now come into the city and kill all of us like Fallujah. Unbelievable. We'll be back. Sick of the globalists. All right, we're